Welcome to this video called Something New. How much fuel is minimum fuel? So when pilots tell us they have minimum fuel or they have emergency fuel, what should that actually mean to controllers? I'm going to admit up front, this topic needs a little bit more work, but I'm going to give you my thoughts as I have them right now here. I'm filming this on January 3rd of 2021, and I want to give very specific answers to what I think controllers should understand when a pilot declares minimum fuel or they have emergency fuel above and beyond kind of existing guidance. So here's where we're going with this. So first of all, this is a standalone lecture. So you can just view this video by itself, but also I view this one as foundational for an upcoming one I call Something New, Multiple Unplanned Missed Approaches, where we talk about an airplane that makes multiple unplanned missed approaches. They're trying to land, they're having trouble getting down, through the soup and so on, and that's going to create a low fuel situation. My primary reference for getting started is something known as an info sheet. I'll explain what that is in a minute because almost all controls have no idea what an info sheet is. The one I'm going to look at is 08004, dated from February of 2008. An info sheet is kind of like an AIM extension, so it's non-regulatory, it's for air carriers. So you're familiar with the AIM for kind of all pilots. Think of the info sheets as like an extension of the AIM for air carriers. This particular one kind of compares minimum fuel, emergency fuel, and reserve fuel. For the record, 7110.65 2-1-8 talks about minimum fuel. And in these kinds of situations, whenever we have a minimum fuel situation or a worse type fuel situation, one of the things I would like controllers to do is ask for the fuel in time, also their expected reserves in time upon landing. Sometimes I think if we just say, okay, you've got minimum fuel or emergency fuel, we say ask for fuel on board, there's some confusion about that, if that's how much they have right now or if that's how much they're going to have on landing. What I'd like to do is, in most cases, try to get both of those if we can, so that we have some idea of what we're working on. Based on the situation, and every situation will be unique, the pilots may or may not be able to answer that with some degree of specificity, and or workload might prevent them. But I would at least like to ask, and if the pilots don't have the time to answer, then so be it. We can't force them. But I would like to make sure we ask for minimum fuel or emergency fuel. Okay. Now, first of all, before I go to this slide, let me make sure I do this in the right order. Let me go to this info sheet. So info just stands information for operators. This is an official FAA document and so on, put out by the Flight Standards Division and so on. And this one, again, is a comparison of minimum fuel, emergency fuel, and reserve fuel. And the purpose is this info is issued to provide education and clarification for operators and pilots about the appropriate use and meaning, connotations, and regulatory definitions of the terms minimum fuel, emergency fuel, and reserve fuel. So let's just kind of talk about the background and definitions. Minimum fuel controllers should already know what this is. There's a definition that's in the AIM. It's also in the pilot controller glossary. And minimum fuel declarations are essentially advisory in nature to controllers. So this is what's being taught to pilots, including air carrier pilots, as a reminder. And so this is advising pilots that the 7110.65 says for controllers, if an aircraft declares a state of minimum fuel, inform any facility to whom control jurisdiction is transferred of the minimum fuel problem and be alert for any occurrence which might delay the aircraft en route. Okay. Use of the term minimum fuel to continue on indicates recognition by a pilot that his or her fuel supply has reached a state where, upon reaching destination, he or she cannot accept any undue delay. This is not an emergency situation, but merely an advisory that indicates an emergency situation is possible should any undue delay occur. And a minimum fuel advisory does not imply a need for traffic priority. Okay, now let's go to the other two pages on this info sheet. So if that's minimum fuel, what is emergency fuel? Emergency fuel, although not defined in the AIM or in any federal aviation regulation, the industry-wide connotation typically associated with the term fuel emergency is the point at which, in the judgment of the pilot in command, it is necessary to proceed directly to the airport of intended landing due to low fuel. Declaration of a fuel emergency is an explicit statement that priority handling by ATC is both required and expected. I'm actually going to go a little bit further, so absolutely endorse that, but I want to be a little more specific, and I'll do that in a few minutes. But for the moment, we'll kind of leave that definition there. And then reserve fuel. It says the regulatory basis for reserve fuel may be found in Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations, and there's different rules. For Part 91, it's going to be 167. For the air carriers, the 121, folks, it's 639. And for the air taxi types 135, it's 135.223. Okay. Now, as an example, 91.167 for the Part 91 operators, I'm going to pare this down to the essential thing. Basically, for IFR flights, you have to have enough fuel at takeoff to get to where you're trying to go, fly to an alternate if you need to, and then, and I've highlighted this for our purposes, fly after that for an additional 45 minutes at normal cruising speed. That's the regulations. It's prudent to carry a bit more than that. Most pilots tend to do that. But officially, that's the regulation. And for what it's worth, if you look up the 121 and 135 requirements, it's essentially the same. So for our purposes, reserve fuel is something like 45 minutes after landing that's still in the tanks, just to give you some background on what the regulations say. Okay, and then under discussion, this is important, this part down here. The act of using a portion of the reserve fuel, so that 45 minutes or whatever, assigned to a flight, is not in itself a cause to declare a minimum fuel state with the controlling agency. Regulations require reserve fuel to enable aircraft to maneuver due to unforeseen circumstances. Many aircraft safely arrive at their destination having used a portion of the fuel designated as reserve, and there is no regulatory definition as to when specifically a pilot must declare either minimum fuel or a fuel emergency. Now, again, a lot of pilots try to be prudent and say, I'd really like to have 60 minutes as my personal reserve, go above and beyond the regulations when I land. But then if you get into that, okay, and you're burning into that reserve a little bit, that's not necessarily a minimum fuel or fuel emergency. So part of the confusion as we kind of approach this topic is there's no specific number that we can attach to this and so on. It is a judgment call. And so where am I going with this? Well, let's go just a little bit further first. So first of all, the guidance to pilots is a recommendation that you declare minimum fuel when in your best judgment. Any additional delay will cause you to burn into your reserve fuel. So if it looks like any extra delay beyond what you're going to get is going to burn into your reserve fuel, that's a recommendation. Pilots can do what they want. Declare a fuel emergency at the point in which in your judgment it is necessary for you to proceed directly to the airport at which you intend to land. That one's interesting. What if there are intervening airports? Okay, and we will talk about that a little bit in this video here. But if you have a fuel emergency and somehow your destination is let's say an hour away and there's 10 other airports on the way, you really should be diverting and so on. So I actually try to modify this in my head a little bit. Obviously, if you're in the terminal area, okay, and you have the fuel emergency begin, now, yeah, you're not going to just set up and land necessarily at that closest airport. You might still proceed to the airport you're intending to land. Certainly for the large air carriers, they're going to bypass some of these GA, 4,000-foot runways and get to the bigger air carrier type airport a little farther away. Declaration of a fuel emergency is an explicit statement that priority handling by ATC is necessary and expected. And by the way, just a reminder, here's what it says in the AIM 5-5-15. And the only thing I'm going to highlight here is, and again, this is what's being told to pilots. So pilots, be aware that when you tell controllers this, a minimum fuel advisory does not imply a need for traffic priority. So you're not getting any priority handling, let alone, as it were, emergency handling. Okay, now, with that in mind, let's go back to the PowerPoint. I'd kind of jumped to this slide a tad early. I look at it a little bit differently. What I view it as is, to me, what I want controllers to think when they hear emergency fuel or mayday fuel or something like that is basically saying not only do I need to go more or less direct, okay, if it's instrument conditions, you don't want to get intercepted, or you don't want to get vectored into intercept too tight, because now you're taking a risk at going missed. Basically, what I want to try to get to, and again, this could stand to be polished up a little bit. I want controllers, when they hear emergency fuel or mayday fuel, to understand that the pilot is saying, I don't have the fuel to go missed. And therefore, I want to work from that observation to kind of put a time on it. So here's what I want to do. So first of all, how long does it take to go from one missed approach to another? So let's assume for discussion purposes that somebody's coming in, and I'm going to use this to represent something like the final approach fix, and then here's the runway threshold. So somebody's coming in, and they somehow have to go missed for whatever reason, okay? Now they got to do another trip, they got to come back around, and then they got to get back to that same point, whichever starting point you use. How long does that take? take. I'll show you just by way of quick reference. If you go to the AIM figure 1-1-7, and I've highlighted the part of the graphic here that shows that the outer marker is typically located about 4 to 7 miles from the end of the runway on the extended center line. Okay, so obviously each one's a little bit different, but I'm going to use 6 as roughly a round value that's fairly typical. So if let's say, and we're looking at this kind of from the side here as it were, but suppose somebody comes in, has to go missed, and now they got to make a trip back around the pattern. I guess they do it above ground, so I better put the mouse up here. But they come back around. How long will it take to get back to that same point? Well, you go missed, you're going to climb out for a minute or two. Okay, so I'm putting about 2 minutes past the missed approach point. It's going to take you 1 minute to do a 180-degree turn. It takes you another 2 minutes to kind of get back a beam where you went missed. Another 3 minutes or so at typical GA airspeeds to get a beam your final approach fix. You go past it for maybe 2 minutes or so, 1 minute turn, 2 minutes to get back, and then maybe 4-ish minutes to get the 6 miles from the final approach fix. Obviously, these are ballpark numbers. You start adding that up, okay, 2 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1 plus 2 plus 4. Next thing you know, you're at 17. Okay, well, you can shorten that up a little bit. So you start this turn back a little quicker. You start this turn back a little quicker, vector them in tight because they're emergency fuel. They cannot accept any more missed approaches, right? Okay, you knock it down to 13 minutes. And again, you get a faster airplane that's a little bit shorter. But really, you know, to go from missed approach at the threshold and fly an actual full approach, okay, not even a full approach, you just get vectored like just outside the final approach fix, you're still talking about 10 to 12 minutes or so for anything like a normal GA airplane. And so if you don't have the fuel to do any more missed approaches, that kind of implies that you're looking at touching down with less than, say, 15 minutes. And that might even be pushing it, as it were. So basically, I want controllers, when they hear emergency fuel, to think that the pilot cannot accept any missed approach, and so we better get this one done right. Plus, they are going to get priority. Obviously, we're not vectoring them out to a 20-mile final because there's 4, you know, who are going to beat them to the airport and so on like that. If it's VMC, okay, and for some reason somebody had to go around on short final, you know, you're talking a much shorter time period. It's only 4 or 5 minutes or so back to get back in for a VMC trip around the pattern. Okay, so basically if somebody says emergency fuel, they have to land. They're going to be touching down with less than 15 minutes, maybe less than 30 minutes for some airplanes, and that's why we treat it as an emergency. By the way, should we vector them in tight? Okay, if it's IMC. So somebody says, I got a fuel emergency, I've got to land. Well, the problem is if we vector them in tight, by doing so in most geometries, it's going to save time. But if we vector them in tight and they have trouble intercepting in real tight, it increases the odds of not flying this approach successfully. I'll spare you kind of some detailed examples, but I think if you sit down, actually look at the math and think about how this would work, I think if we try to vector them in tight, you're really saving just a minute or 2 at most, okay, compared to running them a couple miles farther out to something like the normal approach gate. But now we're risking them going missed because they can't get the approach done properly and so on. And therefore, I would greatly prefer to vector to the normal spot. If they're screaming at us that they're absolutely on fumes, okay, maybe there's an exception, okay? And so I would say do not vector in tighter than normal. So again, don't take them 20 miles out because, you know, it's backed up getting into the airport or something. But don't vector them in any tighter than you normally do unless the pilot explicitly requests to be vectored inside. They are the PIC. If they are explicitly asking to get vectored in really tight or even inside the final approach fix, their PIC, it's an emergency. Their decision goes, do it to the best you can. But unless they explicitly request it, I really want to see controllers vector to the same normal spot using the same kind of intercept angles at the same distances out that we normally would. It is not worth it to save just a minute or so, but increase the odds of the approach getting botched. Okay. To my mind, then, minimum fuel implies that there's only fuel for one missed approach, kind of in addition to what we already have about being aware of any undue delay. So, again, certainly don't vector them in tight if they are minimum fuel. We really do want to get them on the ground without them going missed, okay? So do not vector them in tight. Again, if the pilot explicitly requests it, then you can. If they're minimum fuel and they're asking to vector it in tight, I admit I'm actually tempted to sort of cheat just a little bit and still bring him out just a mile or so farther, or two farther out than they're kind of wanting and so on, just because we really want to improve the odds. And if you sit down and do the math, it's not worth it to save just 10 or 15 seconds and risk missed approach. Okay, so minimum fuel is only enough fuel for one missed approach. And so if I'm using less than 15 as certainly for emergency fuel, then we're talking at least, less than 30 minutes is what is implied. So if somebody just says minimum fuel, I'm thinking that they're going to touch down with less than 30. Now, if the pilot says minimum fuel and we say, how much fuel are you going to have a touchdown? They say 45. Okay, the pilot in command can, in effect, declare some minimum fuel or emergency fuel and have a higher number in mind. But in the absence of some higher number, that's kind of what I'm thinking. So for controllers, if it's IMC and somebody says I'm declaring emergency fuel, in my mind, that means they're going to be touching down with on the order of 15 to 30 minutes, and they really cannot accept a missed approach. And if they say minimum fuel, it's IMC, we're thinking they're going to touch down with between 30 and 45. VMC, I would knock that down to about 15 minutes if they're saying emergency fuel, 25 for minimum fuel. This is for GA. Air carriers might have slightly higher numbers than this because even when it's VMC, they tend to fly approaches. They fly normal instrument approaches essentially, even if they're doing a visual approach, they back it up. Okay. So, one last question, especially for emergency fuel. Is it worth it to divert to the nearest airport? I'm not going to go into a full explanation of this, but I do want to kind of interact with this exchange that was picked up a couple of years ago. You'll hear a sound in a second.
Left, it is Foxtrot. I understand your minimum fuel.
Confirm is the runway 08 left for us, MS 229?
That is correct, runway 08 left. I can offer you the right side if you like, whatever you want.
Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Emirates 229 heavy. We have Mayday fuel and we require runway 08 right.
Okay, I checked the Mayday Emirates. Just plan runway 08 right. And I'll have the vector for you very shortly here.
Emirates 229 heavy, thank you.
And Emirates 229, are you in need of immediate landing?
Affirmative, Emirates 229 heavy.
Okay, would you like to land at Victoria Airport? It's about 10-15 miles closer.
Negative, we are set up for Vancouver, we'll go to Vancouver.
Okay, thanks. Emirates 229, I just want to be clear here. I can offer you either Abbotsford Airport, Victoria Airport. They are both a little closer, and they both have east-west runways, and either that or you can continue with Vancouver.
I love that. That is information for the pilots, okay? I love the fact that he simplifies this, doesn't get into the specifics. By implication, he thinks they'd be long enough for a 777 by providing east-west runways. I have no idea if they're 927 or 725 or something like 1129 or something like that. But east-west, it provides it in a simplified way. Okay, you can continue on. They're both closer, but give that information to the pilot. Let the pilot. Now, I think in this case, what the Emirates flight crew decides to do, based on just the publicly available information, is extremely prudent. You got a 777, you don't just do a quick divert into some little airport necessarily, unless you absolutely have to. He's got the gas to go ahead and do this, so it's still prudent. But I love the fact that the controller advised the flight crew about a pair of closer airports.
It's going to be Vancouver for us, Emirates 229. Thanks for the offer.
Okay, Vancouver it is. Right at Vancouver, is that correct? The right side?
That is correct, Emirates 229.
Okay, runway 08 right. Just advise if you need any other assistance.
Will go, Emirates 229, thank you. Emirates 229, we're leaving 1000 now.
Emirates 229 heavy, the wind at the field at Vancouver 070 at 21 knots gusting to 27.
Roger. Emirates 229, confirm the altimeter.
Vancouver altimeter 2922.
2922, request lower, Emirates 229.
Emirates 229 to send 5,000.
I'll do 5,000, Emirates 229.
Emirates 229, can I get, when you get a minute, please, your souls on board and fuel?
I'll pause here for a minute. I have a general reluctance for some of the souls on board, fuel on board questions. I think both are prudent here. Souls on board, again, you haven't heard of this probably, this incident, which tells us from the vantage point of early 2021 that they made it successfully. They didn't land in I don't know which bay this is or whatever. But at this point, though, live when this is happening, we don't know whether they're going to land successfully or they're going to end up ditching. Because at this point, the plan clearly is to vector them out here, bring them back in. And if they're going to run out of gas, they're probably going to run out of gas, a little bit short, right? So we do have a possible mass casualty event. It's prudent to get the number of people on board. Fuel, again, I'm not going to make a big deal. I would like to find out how much fuel they're going to have upon touchdown. And since they're so close, you would just ask how much fuel do you expect to have when you touch down. If instead they just give you the amount of fuel they have on board, you're only looking at 10 minutes or so at most going in, so you can kind of take whichever answer they give. But let's listen to the answer. Sorry about that.
Fuel.
Stand by.
Okay, Emirates 229, just want to verify. 367 souls on board, 367 and 1/2 hour fuel.
It's 367 and fuel is half an hour, 30 minutes.
Okay, thank you, sir. Do you have any hazmat?
It's 367.
I'm going to back up for a second because Victor's transcript here, and I don't know if it's Victor who does it, he puts in the transcript 1 hour, 30 minutes fuel. If you listen closely, that is not, to me, what the pilot said. Having said that, I think that approach does garble this just a little bit, and that's why the pilot clarified. So do make sure we get the amount of fuel in minutes exactly here, but just listen to it again, and I think this is wrong.
Okay, Emirates 229, just want to verify. 367 souls on board, 367 and 1/2 hour fuel.
It's 367 and fuel is half an hour, 30 minutes.
Okay, thank you, sir. Do you have any hazmat on board?
Negative.
Roger. Emirates 229, contact arrival frequency now 1331.
1331, Emirates 229. Arrival, Emirates 229. We have Mayday, Emirates 229, heavy descending 5000 for red vector 0 right.
Emirates 229, heavy Vancouver arrival. I'll check the Mayday, sir. Descend and maintain 3000.
Descend and maintain altitude 3000, Emirates 229.
Emirates 229, I'm going to set you up for about a 9-mile final. Would you like something tighter than that, sir? Are you okay?
Yeah, 9 miles is fine, Emirates 229, thank you.
So you feel free to ask the pilot that. Myself, I would prefer to not ask it. Again, I'm not going to make a big deal. But if you picture kind of this geometry, suppose the pilot had said something like, yeah, we'd like to be a little bit tighter, and you're going to knock it down to 7 miles, okay? You go 2 miles less distance farther out, 2 miles less distance coming back, that's 4. At a typical speed, he's probably doing 210, 240 or something ground speed. So you're looking at, 4 miles a minute. So you're talking about saving 1 minute, and you're bringing them in tight. And that's why I think the flight crew says, no, 9 miles is fine. So myself, I would generally not volunteer to vector them in tighter. I realize that reasonable people might disagree with that and want to do like this controller did and ask them. I certainly am not in a position to prohibit that, but for what it's worth, I wouldn't even ask. So with that in mind, we'll jump out of this and we're going to bring this to a close here. So I admit this topic needs some further work and so on, but my current suggestion for controllers as of the date I'm filming this is that if we're ever told emergency fuel, it's an expectation that a pilot cannot accept any missed approach, and so let's not vector them in tight, but get them pretty much as direct as we can without bringing them in too tight. If there are closer airports that are nearby that are viable, by all means inform the pilot, but it might be reasonable to the pilot to go beyond that. Now, if they're 100 miles out from their destination, they shouldn't be skipping several airports along the way. That seems kind of stupid / silly. But something in like the terminal area, okay, if they want to continue on to that destination airport and they're bypassing a couple of others that are going to be just a minute or two closer, that's totally prudent. If they say minimum fuel, in addition to how we handle this now, to my mind, it implies that the pilot can accept at most 1 missed approach. So again, I don't want to bring them in tight unless they explicitly ask. Try to make sure that we give them the best possible odds. But anyway, the airplanes might have more endurance than this. No missed approach possible and up to 1 missed approach possible. But I want these to be kind of the expectations when determining how to handle these airplanes. Thank you.